welcome you and welcome everybody to Conservative Coffee Hour. I'm Stanley Smith. I'm here with John Cape. And John, I'm familiar with you somewhat, but I really don't know your background all that much. Do you want to give us a quick introduction to who you are and what your topic is today?
Yes, my name is John Cape. My background is that I've been in the oil and gas industry for about the last 30 years. And my educational background has been undergrad at West Point. I spent 12 years in the Army, and I got a Stanford MBA. So I've got a little bit of some interesting academic credentials. Perhaps my actual experience doesn't match them, but I am a student of climate change. I am not an expert, and everything I provide you will mostly be either identified as my opinion, or I'll give you the source of where I got it from. But I have this understanding that the oil and gas industry has done very little to defend itself. We have done little to counter the science. We have mostly kind of accepted the existing science. And the result of that is that we now find ourselves in a defensive position, trying to defend ourselves from people trying to shut down our investment capital, and also trying to eliminate what we've recently achieved, which was energy independence.
Okay, so you're really approaching the topic of climate change from the energy industry standpoint, because that's your background.
This is my background, and it's also something I've been passionate about for a number of years. The challenge is that the industry itself does not defend itself. I've never been to a presentation within the industry where anyone actually spoke about climate change or any of this stuff I'm going to talk about today. It's ironic, but that's the reality. And I think the fear is that companies think they'll have a big red bullseye on their backs if they try to raise their head above sort of defilade position where they can be attacked by advocates and other enthusiasts of the alarmist theory.
Well, one of our recurring, our bucket list of topics is the idea of messaging and platform and funding and candidates and litigation, and the idea of messaging, the idea that it's really hard to articulate any of these topics. And you talk about the oil industries or energy industry having a target in their backs. I mean, we as individuals in society, we can't discuss climate change because it's a done deal. They've already decided for us. They're dictating to us what we can say about it and what we can't say about it. It's not even a topic for conversation. So I find your topic fascinating. That as far as a counter to it, I don't believe that. I thought we're past the point of having a counter narrative, but I'm open to it. I'm certainly welcome to that idea. John, you made this presentation. Should we share some of what you have here today on this presentation?
I'd be happy to. Could you start up at the second slide, please? There you are. Thank you. Essentially, what you described, I believe, is correct. There is, in fact, a narrative that is put out by the media, and that narrative is one where I'll characterize it like this: that the people release carbon dioxide by burning fossil fuels. These fossil fuels release carbon dioxide emissions that increase atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide leads to a temperature increase, and it is important for us to install wind turbines and solar panels to lower our carbon dioxide footprint. The science is settled, and almost all scientists agree. In addition, every weather event is exacerbated or caused by climate change. That's the narrative that we hear every day in the mainstream media. It's the narrative that our students have to defend themselves against in academia. And in addition, it's the narrative which is promulgated by government organizations such as the IPCC, whose mission is to prove the Human Association to Climate Change, as well as NASA and NOAA, that have all gotten on board with this narrative.
Yes. Well, John, just, we did skip the first slide, but actually there was one part in this first slide I did think was important. This was this word, anthropogenic. So, I did look this up because I thought, well, is this anthropologic? It's not. It's anthropogenic. And it was the idea that all, human activity, just the fact that we're alive, is essentially the problem. If you back up, the climate change story, it's the idea it's based on human activity. So that's really what the driver is, right? We're the problem.
Well, actually, I use this term on purpose because it is sort of the original term that suggests that what has been happening in the last 50 to 70 years is not being caused by the natural causes that have caused it for the last 4.5 billion years of life on the planet. But suddenly in the last 70 years, the assumption is that mankind is causing this. And the anthropogenic global warming just sort of assesses, well, how much is actually can be shown as a fingerprint for mankind. An interesting aside is that the 1990 assessment report from the IPCC had a section 1, that basically had a chapter that looked at the anthropogenic global warming fingerprint. And they came up and said, there was no evidence of one. We don't know. 1995 had the same thing happen, where they all came up and said, we don't know if there is an anthropogenic global warming fingerprint. And then they took that report and they went to the summary and they wrote the summary differently than the report that said, yep, we see an anthropogenic global warming fingerprint. And then they went back and they rewrote the report. So the assumption that anytime you use the word climate change, that it implies an influence by mankind is kind of a marketing and a framing association used by the media. The same thing with global warming, except they don't like using global warming anymore because warming has been so inconsistent. So the term climate change is sort of their way to say, okay, if you hear the word climate change, assume that mankind caused this. The evils of fossil fuels have been our sin that have caused this. And that's more answer than you expected probably, but that's kind of some additional information on what you requested.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Well, I said, I just thought it was an important talking point because I thought it kind of informs your entire presentation. So I'm glad we got that in there. Are you ready for the next slide?
I'm ready for the next slide, yes.
Yes, the sea level is rising.
The reason I include this slide is this is what many of us hear in the media all the time. And in fact, I'm from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. I go to the beach and it looks a little higher than it used to be. And it may in fact be a little bit higher than when I was there in high school. And you see this, it's like since 1990, sea levels have been rising. And a lot of times this will be juxtaposition with a carbon dioxide emissions curve that's been increasing since, maybe really increasing since like 1950. And so the presumption is these two are both slanting upward, and therefore there's causality. What we don't see is the next slide. And this just shows that sea levels have been rising for the last 14,000 years. They've actually increased by about 420 feet since the end of the last glaciation, which happened about every 100,000 years. And so if you knew that where we are now is this little, very slight slant at the top of that on the right side of the screen, you would say, wow, this is really being caused by natural causes. And it's hard to see any kind of an anthropogenic fingerprint on the sea level rise. And that was pointed out to us when they omitted to show us most of the information.
Well, I remember that from high school science class. They said that in many ways you could see that the ice age is still ending in our time. And remember, they even talked about here in the Midwest that our topography was still essentially rising from the retreat of the glaciers. You ready for the next slide?
Sure am.
Okay. Oh, and I love this. This is a great one. This is a whole topic of a conversation right in this one slide, John. Because I love this. The reality is most people don't know. They don't know much, but they're very hesitant to change that. Like, we only know what we think we know, and we really don't want to move from that position. And that is human nature. I can relate to that. I think most people can.
Well, I think that in the current instance of what I'm discussing, it's a little bit more indicative of certain trends. For example, right now, if you look at liberals and conservatives in this country, for the most part, we split the last election very closely. It could have gone either way. Had COVID not happened, maybe it would have. But the point is that politically, we both seem to have very, very different viewpoints on what's going on. I'm not sure either side is very well informed. In general, the people I've spoken to, my own two sisters, will not talk to me in any way, shape, or form, or give me any of their time to ever talk about any of the science that I'm talking about here today, because it's a religion for them. They believe it very differently. And for many people that are on the left already, on the liberal side already, and maybe they're in academia, or maybe they're in the media, or maybe they just believe everything they're told, a lot of them say, no, I'm not capable of understanding the science. I have to trust
Mm.
those scientists to tell me what's important. And so they kind of just abdicate their own personal responsibility. And when you give them new information, they say, well, I'm not the one that came up with any of this stuff. So how can I discern whether or not this last piece of information is relevant to the data set? Because I'm not responsible for the data set. And so it's an article of faith for these people.
Yeah.
And that's why when
But
I have this exchange with like a reporter that I know is on the media side of this thing, there is nothing I could ever say that he would ever agree with regarding what I'm showing you here. He would go right back to the narrative and say, well, have you considered the science is settled? And off we go.
well, John, but that's very interesting that you compare it to religion, because this topic and the next couple of slides are very indicative of that, because it is like religion. People understand doctrine and philosophy and theology, and they understand it and can explain it to you, but they don't. It doesn't inform their lives. Sad to say, they don't. They don't really live differently. They go to church on Sunday and they believe certain things, but they really don't live their lives that way. And I think these next two slides kind of talk about that in regards to climate change. A lot of people have they drank the Kool-Aid on the topic and they can recite what it is, but they really are not. They're not changing their behavior.
Well, this particular slide is actually ambiguous, because we're back to the term of anthropogenic global warming or global warming. Which term do you use, and what do you mean by using that term? Global warming has happened many, many times. Global cooling has happened many, many times. And in the last 150 years, it appears the temperature has gone up about 0.8 degrees Celsius in 150 years. That's about the best guess, because there wasn't a good and pervasive temperature record on the planet. So they're having to wing a lot of this stuff. So to say that global warming is happening, 72% is probably slightly low, because by all indications, there has in fact been a little global warming since the end of the last ice age, which happened in the 1600s and maybe early 1700s. Valley Forge was colder, partly because of the influence of that ice age, and now it's warmer than that. So global warming has been happening. So 72% makes it sound like everybody is swallowing the narrative, when in fact, what it means is there may be some people here that actually understand that it's been slightly warming in 150 years. Not a lot, but a little bit. And so if you look at the next slide, to me, this one drives home the point that for most people, it says adults who think global warming will harm them personally. And you see the purple are the ones who disagree or strongly disagree, and the green are the ones who are strong or higher than the national average. You see most of the US mostly doesn't get to 43%. It's actually a much lower number. And that's because global warming is something that happens to somebody else.
Yes.
And these areas where you see the green, I would contend that California is told they have a lot of forest fires, and they never talk about forest management. They're talking about, forest fires being caused by global warming. And Miami's being told that they'll have hurricanes and they will be possibly underwater because of global warming. And so areas that have been told these narratives of extreme weather seem to think that global warming is more real, but it's still nationally, it's not a very big number. It's 43%. And that's from this survey that's from a fairly partisan survey that's normally trying to support the narrative, but showing them the evidence that it's too dangerous for politicians to think otherwise.
Very interesting. Well, I guess it makes sense that obviously the people in the southern part of the regions are experiencing it more directly, or feel that they're experiencing it more directly than people in the northern.
Or believe what they've been told represents climate change, because we were told that Hurricane Harvey was because of climate change. We're told that droughts in the Northwest right now are climate change. We're told all these different things all the time, and the question is, what do you believe? Now, this particular chart is a chart I would suggest that most people have never seen. It's sort of created by one of the guys who's considered a pretty solid climate critic. He's partly responsible for the satellite programs at the University of Huntsville in Alabama. And you can see here that the green and the blue, the green squares and the blue circles are basically the actual temperature observations. The green squares are from 2 of the 3 satellite data sets. And he's got some influence in making sure that at least one of those satellite sets is honest, or at least is consistent with the actual data. And the weather balloon sets, this is showing 4 different weather balloon sets, that's consistent with these actual observations. So there's been this notion that there's been a pause in global warming, and you kind of see that in this chart, that about 0.2, since 1998, it was pretty flat, and it had been for 20 years. And so there's been this pause, and a lot of the people, even on the alarmist side, have recognized that there's been a pause. But all the climate models, when you take an average of them, they're all showing much greater projection of temperatures than what's actually happened. And there's a huge disconnect. And so the way this is used, people like the IPCC say, well, we're not going to worry about the actual temperatures. We'll just assume the models are correct.
Yeah.
And they assume the theory is more important than the actual, which is bizarre, but that's kind of what they're doing. And the reason the climate models are kind of off is mostly because the weather is a chaotic, nonlinear process. And because of that, it's difficult to make any kind of guesses what the weather will actually do. And they've got these models with all of these parameters in them. And the parameters that are probably most questionable.
Oh, John, I think you froze for just a minute. We lost a couple of the words you said there.
I'm sorry.
About you were talking about the models.
Right. It says my internet connection's unstable. I'm sorry. I hope that goes away. But we're talking, the models themselves. The models have 2 major weaknesses for the most part, and those have to do with how clouds are assumed to be modeled and how water vapor is modeled. Water vapor is the largest greenhouse gas. It's about 4% of the atmosphere, and it can vary from sort of 3% to 4%.
John, we need to get rid of that water then, if that's the largest
greenhouse gas. No, because it's this is the problem. There's nothing that indicates that more carbon dioxide will generate more water vapor. And so this is one of the assumptions. These models all assume it does. And they come up with model projections 2 or 3 times or even more higher than what you would project from simply carbon dioxide warming.
But John,
as a greenhouse gas.
But John, could you say that water vapor is considered one of the greenhouse gases? Is that what you meant to say, or is that what you said?
It is a greenhouse gas, but it's very variable in the climate. It's 2 to 4% of the atmosphere, and it varies everywhere. It's always changing.
But what is the largest? Is carbon dioxide the largest greenhouse gas?
Carbon dioxide is 0.04% of the atmosphere.
What is the largest percentage of greenhouse gas? Is it water vapor?
Water vapor. It's 100 times larger, basically.
Okay.
And explains almost all the warming. And so in order for these models to take this 0.04% of the atmosphere, four molecules out of 10,000 are carbon dioxide molecules, to be able to take that little bit of a change and make it give you these very amped up climate model temperature projections, they have to assume positive feedbacks. And those positive feedbacks are assumed by the influence of clouds and the influence of water vapor. And frankly, they're just not well understood. They're guessing. But I would guess if I was a modeler, I'd say at this point, I would back off on my model and maybe back off on some of those assumed positive feedbacks to make it match actual temperatures.
But John, I think that's an excellent, I love the talking point of the water vapor, because I think that's your best talking point for our conversation with our candidates and voters and pundits of conservative values, the idea that water vapor is the greatest contributor to greenhouse gas. It's the largest percentage of greenhouse gas is water vapor. That's one of those things that creates a disconnect in people's minds that makes them question and ponder this topic in a new way, I think.
Well, it certainly has the largest effect, and
because all we hear about is carbon dioxide and fossil fuel emissions. That's all we hear about.
Yeah, we also hear about methane, but methane is 1/10 of what carbon dioxide is, in terms of, so it's if carbon dioxide's 0.004, methane is 1/10 of that. Mm-hmm. And then they say, oh no, methane has a larger influence. But the reality, these are trace gases in the atmosphere. It's just not much of it that's causing much warming.
Excellent. Those are all excellent things to know about.
Yeah, this slide just basically shows that the carbon dioxide that's been released to the atmosphere has been positive for plants. Mankind accounts for about 3% of the carbon dioxide emissions. There's 97% of the carbon dioxide emissions that are natural. And of his 3%, about 1.5% of them go to greening plants, which is what this shows. The other 1.5% appears to be increasing carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. But it's plant food. It's not a poison, and it's not a pollutant. Yeah, this next slide is kind of a personal opinion, and but it's a personal opinion based upon a lot of other authors that agree with the same thing. And the bottom line is when we look at Europe and Australia, who've been engaged in chasing their own schemes to reduce their carbon dioxide emissions over the last 10 and 15 years, the evidence is that they haven't reduced their carbon dioxide emissions at all. And what's worse is when you look at what they haven't reduced, they've reduced their heavy industry, which has all been sent abroad to other countries that are doing it. And their imports, when you calculate the carbon emissions of the imports of what they get back in and add that to what their carbon dioxide emissions are, they've actually increased their carbon dioxide emissions. So we're being told that wind and solar is the perfect solution. However, as it turns out, wind and solar are actually part of the problem. And the reason this comes about isn't that they can generate sort of clean energy once they're produced. There's a lot of carbon dioxide that goes into producing the materials to set these things up, whether they're foundations, whether they're all the fiberglass blades, whether it's transporting them, whether it's getting them erected. All of this stuff causes carbon dioxide emissions. But what's worse is they are so intermittent that when the wind blows differently, you need a different level of backup power that can step in at a moment's notice and provide the mirror image of what the wind's providing. And to run a natural gas facility like this or a coal facility like this is horribly inefficient. And that inefficiency being run like that means the combination of the backup power and the wind and solar creates these higher carbon dioxide emissions. People are talking about batteries, but they're a long way off. They have none of the capability, and no technology in the near future is going to make it remotely affordable. Then there are the environmental consequences. Wind turbines kill about 5 million bats a year. They're killing lots of eagles, condors, large birds, lots of small birds. Solar panels are toxic. They have heavy metals. They have lead, chromium, chromate, that when a panel is like abandoned and maybe broken and water pours on it from the atmosphere or rain, it'll leach into the water table. And when they build these facilities, they don't make allowance for the cost to remove them in 20 years' time when they got to replace them again. And they also estimate that if you were to try to replace all the energy in the United States with wind and solar, you would require those facilities on about 25% of the United States. They're horribly energy dense, and how that is environmentally favorable is beyond me. It is not clean energy. And it's farthest from the truth. But you always compare, like Alex Epstein is a philosopher, and he talks about this. He said they're always comparing the positives of wind and energy to the negatives of fossil fuels. They really need to start comparing the negatives to the negatives, because right now we're given a whitewash, and we felt it firsthand in Texas with Freeze-Mageddon last February, when a polar front came through, and the demand for electricity doubled, and all the wind turbines froze up. All the bearings froze up, and they all went off the system, and all of it had to be filled in by fossil fuels.
Well, John,
a clear warning.
In a lot of these topics that we look at, we find that the purported solution really isn't really what it's all cracked up to be, and it's usually about something else. So what is the something else with this climate change? What is the goal? What are they trying to accomplish here?
Well, I think this is a great quote. This is from a guy named Michael Schellenberger that released a book last year talking about his experience as an environmentalist and how he sees the picture in the US right now. And I think it's worthwhile for me to actually read this. So this is from a TED Talk that he presents, and I've got the link down below here. I think it's also understandable that as the facts have come in, that many of us have started to question our prior beliefs and change our minds. For me, the question now is, now that we know that renewables can't save the planet, are we going to keep letting them destroy it? And he talks a bit about exactly what I just covered there, about the all the factors of wind and solar, not to mention the fact that if you live near one of these things, there's all sorts of sonic issues. There's all sorts of issues from the sun shining through that wind turbine toward people. I mean, there's lots of other things that will be a good reason why you don't want one of these things in your backyard. The next slide is a good one as well. And this one says that basically the countries where they've installed the greatest amount of wind and solar have the highest electricity prices. And in this case, Germany and Denmark have electricity prices that are 30 cents a kilowatt hour. The UK used to have the cheapest energy prices in Europe. And right now they're very close to Denmark and Germany. Australia has also done a big wind and solar push, and they're above 30 cents a kilowatt hour. So if you believe you want to drive our electricity prices to the moon, this is a clever way to do it, but none of this is ever really mentioned. And all this stuff we read online, or all these editorials we hear about how it's so important that we push wind and solar as our solution. So I'll elaborate upon this a little more in a minute. Okay, this chart is simply a chart from William Happer where so many people are blaming, you know, the increase in hurricanes, the increase in tornadoes, the increase in floods or droughts. And this is just sort of the data over time of what the frequency of these storms have been in the United States. And you see there's virtually no change. If anything, there were more tornadoes in the past. There are higher levels of hurricanes in the past. Drought and floods are about the same. So a lot of this is just noise. People making claims when they're not trying to really show you what the actual statistics are showing. And that's not science. That's somebody who's an advocate trying to convince you of a particular point.
But again, like, why is that? What is this all about? What's the point of all this? Who's behind all this? What industry is driving this? So you mentioned that the energy industry has not pushed back. Are they driving it, or who is driving this? Who's making money off of this?
Well, that's a difficult question, because it's not just making money. I mean, if let's say, for example, that we could destroy our economy, and there's something called absolute zero, and it's called absolute zero emissions, which is a policy in the United Kingdom right now. It's not in the U.S. yet, but it's simply a more descriptive version of the net zero policy that's already here, that President Biden is moving us toward. And so they show the idea that carbon dioxide emissions are increasing, and suddenly we make a decision and down they come. And then we have a carbon dioxide free world. And so the reason I say this is a dumb idea is take a look at the next slide. This is basically the success that we've had dealing with carbon dioxide emissions. These are all the conferences. This is the Paris Agreement. You see all these things have happened. And what's happened? It hasn't really decreased any of our carbon dioxide emissions, because there are countries that don't participate. There are only a few countries that are participating in doing this. And look at the next slide.
With the thing about China, I love how this is red line. This is China's growth of emissions, and it's like skyrocketing. Everyone else is kind of plateauing and maybe even leveling off or going down. China is continuing their exponential climb.
Yeah, China is now responsible for 30% of the world's global warming, or with carbon dioxide emissions. And India is this line in yellow. They are moving at a rapid pace. Both China and India are building a large volume of coal power plants right now. Now, these power plants are more efficient, and they're state-of-the-art power plants compared to the ones that used to be in China, which were like 11% efficient, maybe 20% of the efficiency of a good power plant in the West. But the ones China's building now are good power plants. And so if you notice the US is this little orange line that's gone down a little bit after 2000. And that's come about mostly because of fracking. We have replaced coal power plants with cheap natural gas, and that's reduced our carbon dioxide emissions by 15%. If you look at Europe, Europe's basically not achieved as much of a decrease as we have, and they've in wind and solar, and also biomass. They've got these facilities that burn wood chips now in Europe that are bringing whole forests from North Carolina to Europe so they can burn these things. And And guess what? They don't even count the carbon emissions when they do that because they consider wood sustainable. So all kind of games are being played with this. But right now, if you look at this, you say, if China and India aren't really playing, then what does it really advantage the US or Europe to unilaterally do this to ourselves? And the next chart will show you sort of the guts and bolts, or the nuts and bolts. This is from the Absolute Zero program, which is a UK government organization telling them how the country's supposed to evolve. They're supposed to get rid of all airports, supposed to stop all shipping, get rid of all gasoline and diesel cars, get rid of all meat, get rid of cement, get rid of concrete, get rid of all fossil fuels. It basically would take the country to the same energy consumption level of the average per capita energy consumption in Bolivia today. And this is where they're taking the UK. Why are they doing this unilaterally? If India and China are making all these investments to improve the quality of life for their citizens in their country. And carbon dioxide emissions are going to continue to increase regardless of what these guys choose to beat themselves up to do. I don't think the US should follow their lead. I think we need to look harder at what the US and Australia have done to themselves. And why this isn't being shared with us in the media is beyond me, other than the fact that it's not supporting their narrative.
Well, at this point in the narrative, it would take a major change in direction or a major disruption to change this whole, shake this up enough to change this narrative, I think.
I think you're right. Yeah, this is sort of another set of points that are in these conservative talking points. And the points should be spelled P-O-I-N-T-S. I apologize. I thought I caught that.
You know, John, I love these kinds of presentations because that's how you know people are paying attention, because we get all these notes in the chat when people find a mistake. So mistakes are always good to sprinkle in there because that's how you know people are paying attention.
Yeah, good. Well, there's a mistake. I corrected it in my version, but I guess I forgot to correct it in your version.
That's all right.
But ESG right now is essentially a partisan attack on the fossil fuel industry. All these companies are having to sort of swear their dedication and commitment to reduce their fossil fuel consumptions, and industry and investors are trying to whittle down all the investment for the fossil fuel industry, and all this stuff is happening, and ESG is leading the charge, and frankly, I'd be very wary of that. The second point is that nuclear energy, if you really believe that CO2 is dangerous, why aren't you increasing the nuclear power plants in the United States? France used to have about 75% of their electricity come from nuclear power. We could have done the same thing. Why are we closing nuclear power plants in New York and California to replace them with very unreliable wind and solar energy? Yeah, it makes no sense. And this is one of the important contradictions to recognize that really gives away the hand of the people that we're dealing with. These people just want to make us hurt, apparently. Forget carbon taxes. Carbon taxes a lot of times are proposed by economists and conservatives that believe too much of the narrative. And unfortunately, until we get more of the narrative corrected, I don't suggest we support it in any way. I think we should forget about carbon taxes, forget about trying to make amends with our souls and our guilt by doing all this stuff. So the next table kind of summarizes all these different points. And I'm going to cheat down a second and look at my notes here. And
oh yeah, this is like a synopsis of all the different talking points together.
Yeah, this is a talking point. But the thing to take away from this chart is there's two columns to the right, and the column to the right means the idea is right. This is a good time to challenge this point. The column to the far right, in sort of a tan color, I think it's equally true, but there's been so much.
Oh, John, you just froze for just a minute, but I think you're trying to navigate the idea of which topics are most profitable to talk about and which ones probably are going to be a loss leader.
Much resistance, so many people fighting back against us, that even so it's true. Yeah, my internet's being shown as unstable again, but even though it's true, I think our ability to press it now is going to be met with strong resistance and just blockage in a way that maybe the green points, I think, we'd see some concessions on. And so the green points I'm going to emphasize are that Item number one, there is a narrative. Just recognize it exists. Pay attention to it. Try to see it in your own experience. When someone mentions climate change, who's saying it, and what point are they trying to convince you of? Second, number two, the models are overamped. Don't believe them when they tell you we have to do this to decrease our models, decrease what the temperature projected our models, because that's not, if we did everything they asked us to do, it would still not improve the weather one little bit. More carbon dioxide is good for plants. Wind and solar should no longer be subsidized. And I guess the best example of this is that here in Texas, we have competitive energy in ERCOT, which is the Texas grid. And we have our own little grid here in Texas that we discovered more fully back during Freeze-Mageddon last February. And one of the things that's true about that grid is that wind and solar can bid a negative price for electricity. They can bid a minus half cents a kilowatt hour for electricity. Nuclear, coal, natural gas cannot bid a negative price for energy and make any money. But wind and solar can, because their subsidies are so high. And so the subsidies give them such a large preference, they end up putting the reliable energy producers out of business. And it destabilizes our entire system. They claim that they are cheaper than all the other energy sources. I would say, let them prove it. Let them show us. Stop the subsidies. Let them show us why their economics really make sense. And if they do make sense, then we won't be increasing our electricity prices if we go this direction. But if there's backup power required, they should pay for it. If there are cables required to run to offshore locations, they should pay for it. Anything to support the wind and solar has to be paid for by them, just like it is by the fossil fuels. Let's compare economics against economics and not use the heavy thumbprint of the government to pick favorites, which is what has been happening. So data point, number 7 here, that net zero is a dumb idea.
Yes.
We as a civilization should not be planning on reducing our energy consumption. Energy is a form of wealth. And we have to think about what your house would be like if you had to get rid of your washing machine, your refrigerator, walk to work. I mean, at what point in time do we reach a lifestyle that is so painful and punitive when you have to grow all your own vegetables? At what point in time does that really improve the economic well-being of the United States? It doesn't. And we shouldn't believe this canard that we need to cripple our economic capability while China and India especially are doing nothing. If we all want, everybody in the world wants to cripple economic capability, maybe they could sell us on this. But right now, with India and China doing nothing, don't swallow that. Point number 9, there is nothing wrong with nuclear energy. We've made it criminal, we've criminalized it in this country. We've made it almost impossible to build a nuclear power plant. And even if we don't believe in wind and solar, and even if we've got 100 years of fossil fuels left, both points which are true, there at some point we will need to make a transition from fossil fuels, and nuclear right now is the technology that makes the most sense. We should allow nuclear technology to go forward. Schellenberger's got a good book on this. He's a bit of a believer from the alarmist camp in the old days, and doesn't diss the carbon dioxide theory as much as I'd like him to, but he's very strong that nuclear is the only smart way to go. And a lot of environmental harm is going to come about from wind and solar. The 10th point, forget about carbon taxes. It's the wrong idea, and a bunch of bad assumptions driving that kind of thinking. Now, this could complete my presentation if you're out of time. If not, I can keep walking through more of my slides that are interesting.
Well, John, I'm going to stop the screen share just for a moment here and offer people who do want to bow out a chance to do so, because that is, I will say, that is a tremendous amount of information. I thought your talking points were very good. I love the thing about the water vapor, and I love about the idea about the zero emissions is a dumb idea. And your whole table, I think we'll share your table with those who attended this first section, and we'll say goodbye to those people who don't have time for the second section, and they can enjoy the rest of it on Saturday when we meet for our regular Zoom meeting. But again, I think it's a really interesting topic, and I really give you credit for even tackling it, because I live in Chicago, which is like a vortex of liberalism, and I don't think any of us could even talk about the topic the way you did today. So I appreciate that, and I thank you very much.
Well, it's difficult for anybody to get educated on this. I'm actually writing a novel now about this, and I've written the book. I'm sort of fine-tuning it now, trying to improve some characterization, maybe add some more sex to it, make it more readable as a novel. But it's forced me to have to improve my own understanding of this field. But if you try to research for yourself, you literally can't find this material. Anyone who's actually active in the field, like Richard Lindzen is an MIT climate scientist who's been very central in putting out some of the criticism to some of this narrative and some of the other theory. But if you Google his name, you'll end up with 5 pages of basically character assassinations before you reach his name, and all these people that are trying to say no, he can't be believed and he's not viable. And so we have to go through this anytime we want to look at something other than the narrative we're being told. And so the purpose of my novel is actually educational. I'm going to have a bunch of resources in it showing you the websites I like the best, showing the novels I like the best,
Perfect.
showing you many times the information given in this particular presentation, because there's a lot of science and most of it's on the side against the narrative, not for the narrative.
Interesting. What's the name of the novel going to be?
Well, the original book was called Oil Dusk. And so this could be called Oil Dust too. The original novel I wrote back in 2006 was about, of course, oil scarcity. And in that world, oil scarcity was something that we all feared. We were building LNG import facilities in the United States. And along came fracking, and all of that changed. I was actually up in Pennsylvania working on the Marcellus, buying acreage and natural gas fracking plays. At the time, I finally self-published my book. But the book was interesting because it provides a nice contrast. Scarcity is a completely different version of what could happen to oil and gas than a keep it in the ground logic, which is what we're facing now with this narrative. And so the book just kind of tells a story about what does this really mean to us individually and personally.
Well, you're right. With the advent of fracking, you do need to write volume 2. John, I'm just going to say goodbye right now, and then we will tune back in just a moment for version 2, section 2. Thanks. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.